Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the summer of 1898, American troops stood in Havana with no enemy left to fight. Spain was gone. The war was over. And yet the U.S. Army did not leave. Washington had a problem it hadn't planned for. The United States had gone to war to save Cuba, but winning that war meant it now controlled the island. Generals wanted to stay. Business leaders wanted ownership. Politicians wanted credit for victory. But buried inside the declaration of war was a single sentence that made annexing Cuba politically radioactive. The United States had promised, publicly, that it would not take the island. This is the story of how America won a war, trapped itself with its own promise, and discovered that owning Cuba was far more dangerous than controlling it. Cuba had been at war long before the United States arrived. For decades, Cuban rebels had fought Spain in a grinding struggle for independence, only to be crushed and regroup again. By the 1890s, the conflict had turned brutal, and Spain's grip on the island was slipping. Spanish authorities responded with force instead of reform. Entire rural populations were herded into fenced camps under military guard. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Tens of thousands died in full view of foreign observers. American journalists reported the suffering in graphic detail, turning Cuban misery into front-page news. These stories landed in a country already primed to intervene. American businesses had invested heavily in Cuban sugar and railroads, and instability threatened profits. But the outrage went beyond economics. The idea that a European empire was openly brutalizing civilians just off the U.S. coastline clashed with how Americans liked to see themselves, as a power that stood against old-world imperial cruelty. By the time the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, the public no longer needed certainty. Spain denied responsibility. Investigations were inconclusive. It didn't matter. The narrative was already written. Intervention was framed as rescue, not conquest. Congress authorized war under that premise. The United States was not fighting to take territory, but to free Cuba. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because it set expectations that victory would soon make impossible to ignore. The fighting itself was brief. Spanish forces collapsed in the Caribbean and the Pacific with startling speed. What many expected to be a long, costly war ended in months. Spain's empire didn't erode. It fell apart. The speed of victory created a problem. Wars that drag on force governments to think carefully about the aftermath. This one didn't. The United States defeated Spain before it had worked out what winning was supposed to look like. When Spanish authority vanished, American troops filled the vacuum. They entered Havana as liberators, but stayed as occupiers. There was no Spanish army left to defeat, no Cuban government ready to take control, and no clear plan for what came next. For the first time, the contradiction became visible. The United States now held the island it had promised not to take. The war had been sold as salvation, but the result looked uncomfortably like replacement. And as American officers settled into government buildings across Cuba, one question began to surface quietly, then loudly, then everywhere at once. If the United States had gone to war to free Cuba, why was it still there? The contradiction in Cuba's occupation did not go unnoticed in Washington. In fact, it had been anticipated, though few had grasped how dangerous it would become. Months earlier, as Congress rushed toward war, one senator had insisted on putting limits on victory itself. That senator was Henry Teller. Teller was not trying to design foreign policy for the next century. He was trying to prevent the United States from becoming the very kind of empire it claimed to oppose. As the war resolution moved through Congress, he forced in a single clause: the United States would not annex Cuba once Spain was defeated. The amendment passed with little resistance. At the time, it seemed harmless, almost symbolic. Few lawmakers believed the war would end quickly, and fewer still imagined the United States inheriting Spain's global empire in one stroke. It was easy to promise restraint before anyone knew how much power they were about to gain. Support for the amendment came from strange alliances. Sugar interests feared Cuban competition. Southern Democrats feared what annexation might mean for race and voting power. Others genuinely believed Cuba deserved independence. These motives didn't align, but they didn't need to. They all pointed to the same sentence. That sentence now sat at the center of the problem. American generals on the ground wanted time to stabilize the island. Business leaders wanted security for investments. Expansionists saw Cuba as the logical next step in American power. But the Teller Amendment made annexation politically toxic. Repealing it was technically possible. Doing so publicly would mean admitting that the war's moral justification had been conditional from the start. It would turn a war sold as liberation into something much harder to defend. No one wanted to be the politician who explained that reversal to voters. The result was paralysis. The United States controlled Cuba but could not claim it. It had won the war, but the very document that authorized that war now limited what victory could look like. Power had outrun permission. The Teller Amendment became more than a law. It became an obstacle, an ever-present reminder that the United States had promised something it now found inconvenient. Every decision in Cuba had to work around it. And so Washington searched for ways to stay without taking, to rule without owning, and to delay a choice that no longer had a clean answer. That search would play out on the island itself, where American troops were still very much in charge, and where the promise of liberation was starting to feel increasingly hollow. American troops entered Havana as liberators, but liberation came without a handover. Spanish flags came down, American uniforms stayed, and no Cuban government was invited to take control. There was no exit date posted on any wall, no schedule for withdrawal, and no explanation that satisfied the people who had been fighting for independence long before the United States arrived. For American commanders on the ground, staying felt practical. The island was exhausted by war. Rail lines were damaged, cities were unhealthy, and the countryside was unstable. From a military perspective, leaving quickly looked irresponsible. Order had to be restored, they argued, before power could be transferred. But to Cubans, the view was different. The Spanish were gone, yet another foreign army now occupied government buildings, ports, and customs houses. Rebel leaders who had expected recognition were sidelined. The promise of independence, so loudly proclaimed during the war, suddenly felt postponed without explanation. Washington leaned on a technicality. The Teller Amendment barred annexation, not occupation. It said the United States would not take Cuba, but it said nothing about how long American troops could remain. Legally, the letter of the promise was intact. Politically, its spirit was eroding by the day. This gray zone became a pressure cooker. American officials insisted they were preparing Cuba for self-rule. Cuban leaders asked when that preparation would end. Each delay made the answer harder to give. Leaving too soon risked instability. Staying too long risked revealing that liberation had limits. Back in the United States, the optics worsened. Newspapers that had once demanded intervention now questioned why American soldiers still patrolled Cuban streets. Critics asked whether the United States had simply replaced Spain as overseer. Supporters replied that withdrawal without guarantees would be reckless. Neither side had a satisfying solution. The occupation exposed the core problem created by victory. The United States had removed Spain but inherited responsibility. It wanted stability without ownership, influence without annexation, and it needed a way to justify staying without admitting it had broken its promise. By refusing to leave and being unable to take, the United States narrowed its options. Occupation could not be permanent, but withdrawal without leverage felt dangerous. Something had to give. The question was no longer whether Cuba would be independent. It was what kind of independence the United States would allow and what price it would demand before stepping aside. For a moment, Washington confronted the option it avoided saying out loud. What if the United States simply ignored its promise and annexed Cuba anyway? Militarily, it could be done. Spain was gone. American troops were already in control. The obstacle was not force, it was consequence. What terrified Congress was not theory, but numbers. Census data collected in 1899 by the U.S. War Department painted a picture that few lawmakers wanted to confront. Cuba's population stood at roughly 1.57 million people, not distant subjects, but potential citizens. More than 520,000 of them were classified as black or mulatto, nearly a third of the population by American racial categories of the time. Even more alarming to lawmakers was education. Nearly 64% of Cubans were illiterate, a statistic that immediately collided with America's racialized voting politics at the turn of the century. To segregationist Southern Democrats, annexation was not expansion, it was political suicide. Granting U.S. citizenship to such a population threatened the racial hierarchy that underpinned their power at home. New voters, new legal claims, and new demands for representation would force questions Congress had spent decades avoiding. Denying Cubans full citizenship would have been no safer. It would mean openly admitting that the United States had conquered a population it did not intend to treat as equals. That contradiction would expose the war's moral justification as hollow and invite legal challenges, domestic backlash, and international scrutiny. Economic interests added another layer of resistance. American sugar producers feared Cuban competition if the island were fully incorporated. Investors wanted stability and access, not the regulatory obligations and political uncertainty annexation would bring. Ownership promised more headaches than control. Seen clearly, annexation stopped looking inevitable. It looked reckless. The United States would gain land but lose flexibility. Every Cuban crisis would become an American crisis by default, tied directly to Congress and the Constitution. The question shifted. It was no longer whether the United States could annex Cuba. It was whether annexation would strengthen American power or expose its deepest political fault lines. Once that calculation was made, the promise not to annex no longer felt like a restriction. It began to look like an escape. The deadlock over Cuba's future began to loosen with a change in leadership. When Theodore Roosevelt moved into the White House, he brought a perspective shaped by personal experience. Roosevelt had fought in Cuba. He had seen the island up close, and he had little patience for abstract debates divorced from practical outcomes. Roosevelt did not want a traditional empire. He believed old-style colonialism created more problems than it solved, especially in places as close and volatile as the Caribbean. But he also distrusted the idea of simply leaving. In his view, weak states invited instability, and instability in Cuba would inevitably draw the United States back in, on worse terms. This led him to a blunt conclusion. The United States should not annex Cuba, but it should also not pretend that Cuba could be left entirely to its own devices. Independence, he believed, had to be supervised. Freedom without limits was, in his mind, an invitation to chaos. Roosevelt's solution was neither occupation nor withdrawal. It was control disguised as restraint. Cuba would become an independent republic, but one whose room for maneuver was carefully narrowed. The United States would step back formally while keeping the tools to step in whenever it chose. This approach solved several problems at once. It respected the letter of the Teller Amendment by avoiding annexation. It avoided the political disaster annexation would trigger at home. And it preserved American influence without committing the United States to permanent governance. Crucially, it also shifted responsibility. Under this model, Cuba would govern itself and bear the blame when things went wrong. The United States would intervene only when necessary, positioning itself as a stabilizing force rather than a ruling power. Control would be exercised selectively, not continuously. What Roosevelt needed was a legal mechanism to lock this arrangement in place. Occupation alone could not do it, and promises were no longer enough. The next step had to bind Cuba's independence to American authority in writing. That mechanism was already being drafted. And once it was imposed, the question of annexation would finally disappear, not because it was forbidden, but because it had been outmatched by a more effective strategy. The mechanism Roosevelt needed arrived in 1901, embedded not in a treaty negotiated as equals, but as a condition. Congress attached a set of requirements, known as the Platt Amendment, that Cuba had to accept before American troops would leave the island. Independence was offered, but only if it came pre-limited. Those limits were explicit. Cuba was barred from making treaties that might threaten American interests. The United States reserved the right to intervene militarily whenever it judged Cuban stability, or American property, to be at risk. And Cuba was forced to lease land for American naval bases, ensuring a permanent U.S. military foothold, most notably at Guantanamo Bay. For Cuban leaders, the choice was brutally narrow. Reject the amendment, and the occupation would continue indefinitely. Accept it, and independence would arrive constrained, conditional, and supervised. With the economy shattered and no leverage left, they signed. From Washington's perspective, the result was decisive. The Teller Amendment still blocked annexation, but the Platt Amendment made annexation unnecessary. The United States secured intervention rights, strategic dominance, and control over Cuba's foreign alignment without inheriting the political and moral burdens of ownership. This resolved the crisis victory had created. America could claim it had kept its promise not to annex Cuba. Troops could withdraw while influence remained. Responsibility was shifted outward, while power stayed firmly in American hands. Once the Platt Amendment was in place, the debate ended quietly. There was nothing left to gain by taking Cuba outright. Ownership would only make American power more visible and more vulnerable. The United States had learned the ultimate lesson of modern empire. You don't need to own a country to control it. You just need to own the chaotic liberty of its independence.